So again, thank you for joining us this evening. You're now attending the webinar entitled Dark with Excessive Bright, the Music and Advocacy of Missy Mazzoli. So Grammy-nominated composer Missy Mazzoli was recently deemed one of the more consistently inventive, surprising composers now working in New York from the New York Times. Her music has been performed all over the world by the Kronos Quartet, Eighth Blackbird, Dublin's Crash Ensemble, pianist Emmanuel Axe, Opera Philadelphia, Scottish Opera, Opera Comique, LA Opera, Cincinnati Opera, the Detroit Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, LA Philharmonic, the Minnesota Symphony, the BBC Symphony, the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Atlanta Symphony, the Sydney Symphony, the Jack Quartet, and many others. In 2018, she made history when she became one of the first of two women to be commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. That year, she was nominated for a Grammy in the category of Best Classical Composition for her work, Vespers for Violin, recorded by violinist Olivia de Prado. Highlights of her 2023-24 season include being the featured composer at the Winnipeg New Music Festival, the focus of a BBC Total Immersion, a new ballet by choreographer Rob Benet for London's Royal Ballet, and Breaking the Waves at Detroit Opera, Proving Up at Pittsburgh Opera, and numerous international performances of her classical and chamber repertoire. Tonight, she will also discuss her work as a nonprofit leader. She will use her work as a lens through which to discuss the ever-changing landscape for women and non-binary composers who remain vastly underrepresented and underpaid, and the founding of the Luna Composition Lab, a nonprofit she started with composer Ellen Reid to support female and non-binary composers in their teens. And I saw on your Instagram that it seems like Missy has a forthcoming Tiny Desk concert on NPR's YouTube channel, so please check that out. So thank you so much, Missy, for joining us tonight, and I invite you to begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you for everybody who is joining. And I'm just so thrilled to be here talking to you tonight in this slightly strange but awesome format. And so excited to be able to connect with so many people at once. This is really a very cool platform. As Meredith mentioned, I am a composer. I'm also a pianist. I am also a professor at Bard College, where I teach music composition, and I also teach a class on how to write operas. And I am the co-founder and artistic director of a nonprofit that I started 8 years ago called Luna Composition Lab. Again, as Meredith mentioned, we support female, non-binary, and gender non-conforming composers in their teens. And that has been just a really rewarding, amazing complement to the creative work that I've been doing. And I'll go into that in detail at the end of this presentation. So creatively, I am very interested in redefining and amplifying the role of the composer in the 21st century. And for me, this means that I'm creating musical works that reflect the time in which we're all living, that reflect my own time, my own experience, our own time. And I remain active not only as a writer of music, but as a performer of music. For many years, I had a band called Victoire because I found that when I would tell people, oh, I'm a composer, like their eyes kind of glaze over, and it's like no one knows what that means in the 21st century. But if I say, oh, I'm in a band, and then they're like, cool, and their ears became very open to whatever I was going to get up there and play. And there was this understanding that if I have a band, I'm going to stand up in front of you, and I'm going to play music that I wrote. So just the change of language there, calling it a band instead of calling it an orchestra or a new music ensemble or a project or whatever, like it just was really, it opened up the places where I was able to present my own music. And, a big part of my work is advocating for increased diversity and openness within classical music in terms of gender, race, but also stylistic diversity. And this all kind of adds up to a mission of, my wanting to demystify music composition. I, spent a lot of time as a young person thinking that music composition was this impenetrable, thing that was only for geniuses and maestros. And that I think is a big deterrent that makes people feel very alienated from the art form. And, it wasn't until after doing it, day in and day out for decade after decade that I felt like this isn't really that mystical. It's like any other job. You do it every day and, it starts to make sense to you. And it's something that I wish more people felt qualified to speak about and to have opinions about and more people had a way into. So the demystification of music composition is a big part of my job, not only as a teacher, but as an advocate for the art form and for more diversity within the art form. So, I've always been very drawn to writing music as a very young person, and I was eager to call myself a composer very young because I felt that, that word composer would allow me to do a lot of different things and not be bound by genre, by trends, by instrumentation or tradition. And I was always very interested in many different things. So very interested in art, poetry, theater, philosophy, and, performing as well as composing. And composing was a sort of really big umbrella through which to investigate all of those things. So the way that has translated into my adult life, I'm currently 43. So I've been doing this professionally for 20 years. And what that looks like is that I do a lot of different things all the time. So I'm writing music for soloists. I'm writing music for orchestras, string quartets, various chamber ensembles. I do a lot of opera and dramatic work. I really, in the last 10 years, been gravitating towards that. And I also do a little bit of writing of music for TV and film. So if you tuned into this webinar a couple minutes early, or about 10 minutes early, you actually heard a piece that I wrote for the TV show Mozart in the Jungle, which was on about 10 years ago. It was a really wacky show about classical musicians in New York. I don't know how realistic it was, but it was really fun. And it was very fun to write music for that. And I've done a little bit of film scoring as well. And the other great thing about being a composer is that it allows me to collaborate with lots of people. So I'm very interested in collaboration with artists of other disciplines, visual artists, filmmakers, writers, and all of my work allows me to do that, especially the opera and dramatic work. So that's kind of an overview of, what my life looks like now. Every day I'm writing music for these various collaborators and ensembles and situations, and I'm teaching a lot every day, and I'm also running my nonprofit. So every day is very full, but full of many different things. So I'd like to actually start us off with a performance of sorts. I'm going to play you lots of videos of performances, and they're mostly pretty short. They're mostly between like 2 minutes and maximum like 5 minutes. And this first one is a video that was put out by the Gagosian Gallery in New York. And it's part of a series they have called Gagosian Premieres, where they invite performing artists into the gallery to perform and to talk about whatever exhibit is up on the walls at that time. So this was filmed, I remember the date very clearly. It was January 7th, 2021, a few years ago. And I went into the gallery to perform a piece of mine on piano called The Night Ahead and No Real Fate. This title comes as a sort of collaboration with a writer. The title comes from a story by the writer Sam Pink, who's based in the Midwest and who is a brilliant poet and short story and novel writer. And this is a work for piano and electronics. And so what I mean when I say that is that I will play piano, and then out of the speakers, you'll hear an electronic soundscape that I created. If anyone's into, electronic music software, I created it using Ableton. I love Ableton. I love that platform, and it's really flexible and fun. And, you'll notice, or I think you'll notice in the video that you'll see an earbud in my ear. So I stay lined up with the electronics through a click track, which is just a fancy name for a metronome that clicks into my ear and keeps me lined up with the electronic soundscape. I'm going to get a little music nerdy here. I hope that's okay. This is a musical composition that starts in the middle of the piano. So it starts with a single note in the middle of the piano, and then it consistently transposes itself outward. So what I mean by that is that I play the same musical idea basically over and over, but the right hand gets higher and the left hand gets lower. And the way this piece is constructed is that it does that expanding pattern until it's almost at the outer edges of the piano, and then it snaps back into the middle and does the same thing again, but faster, transposing outward until we reach the very highest note and the lowest note of the piano, and then the piece is over. So this might seem really mathy and not so I don't know, not so wild and creative, but this is often the way that I work my way into pieces, is by having some sort of mathematical structure or concept, and hopefully that within that I'm able to find a very creative, very organic kind of expression. But the sort of foundation, the scaffolding for the work, there has a lot of math going on. So, and this was filmed during an exhibit by the American painter Ed Ruscha. So you'll see a lot of his paintings on the wall too. So I'd love for Mike, if you could just play that first video, that'd be great.
Ruscha probably knows as well as anybody how important it is for an artist to have a sense of community of artists where your work can have a particular meaning and also just feel like you're part of a living space. When the gallery started to create its own performance program, that dialogue naturally continued. And two people who immediately came to mind were Missy Mazzoli, who is known more for her neoclassical work and work in opera, and Ellen Reid, who had worked at the kitchen over the decades as well, both in theatrical performances and part of the Black Rock Coalition. And having these two sides of music manifested in, I think, a very American context, given the iconography of the paintings, felt really resonant. And when the opportunity was discussed with them, they were very excited as well.
30 years ago, it seemed like the major cities of America were where all the artists are. Now they live on farms and they live out in the sticks. All art is made from other art. I mean, things come in lineages and influences. We've all got our different problems, and here we are.
Okay, so that was The Night Ahead and No Real Fate. That's me performing in the Gagosian Gallery. And I'd also, before I move away from instrumental music, I'd love to play another video of an excerpt from a piece of mine for a slightly bigger ensemble. So I wanted to play this because this is where I got the title for this webinar. It's a piece called Dark with Excessive Bright. And this is actually a concerto for soloist and string orchestra. So this is a concerto for double bass, so a solo double bass player and a string orchestra. And we're going to see the performance by the LA Philharmonic. But before we do that, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about this piece because it has a very interesting origin story. So this was a commission from an orchestra in Australia, the Australian Chamber Orchestra. They wanted me to write a piece that featured their double bassist. And I was having a really hard time writing this. I was just like, the double bass is not a solo instrument usually. You know, it's buried at the bottom of the orchestra. It's not the most agile instrument. It doesn't like project that much. And I started listening to all these double bass concertos, and I just didn't like any of them. Like, I was just really struggling to find a way in. And usually when I'm struggling to find a way in, I'll listen to a lot of music for that same instrumentation, and then something in music history will sort of inspire me to create something new. But I was just really struggling. And so I called the double bass player and I just said, just talk to me about yourself and like, what music are you interested in? And like, why do you like playing the double bass? I mean, I was really grasping for anything. And at the end of this conversation, he said, oh, I think I'm going to play this piece on my old bass. And I was like, what do you mean your old bass? Like, what does that mean? He's like, oh, well, I have an instrument that was built in 1580. And I was like, oh my God, this is interesting. And that just really was such a cool, crazy thing that something that was built that long ago was still being used for its intended purpose every day, was still being played every day. So I was like, tell me about this instrument. Like, how did it survive? And it turns out that this instrument has an amazing history. It was built in Italy in 1580, as I mentioned, but with the wood of a pear tree that had been growing in Croatia since the 1300s, this 200-year-old pear tree. And then for 400 years was hidden in a monastery in northern Italy. And the monks there would take care of it and would patch the holes in this instrument with pages from the liturgy. So when they went to restore it in the 1970s, the bass was sort of rediscovered in the 1970s. The monastery sold it. They found all this paper from like the 1600s to the 1800s kind of shoved in the cracks of this instrument. So it just was just a fascinating thing that this existed in the world. And it was, the monastery itself was bombed during World War I, but the monks protected this bass. So I just felt that this object had a very interesting history and almost a very human history. It was like a person who had lived through all these things. Anyway, so that was my way into this piece, was imagining this instrument as a storyteller. So the double bass, is emerging in the 21st century to tell us all its story. And so there are a lot of quotes from Renaissance music, from the time when this instrument was built. There are a lot of sort of Baroque ornamentations in this piece that, because the bass existed and was played at that time. And then there are a lot of modern techniques. So it's all sort of woven together in one piece. So, and just a little note about the title. The title, Dark with Excessive Bright, is actually a quote from Milton's Paradise Lost, in which Milton is describing the robes of God as being dark with excessive bright, which is a really striking phrase. It's kind of an impossible, striking phrase, but it really, like, that to me is what the double bass sounds like. It's dark, but it has this incredible edge, this incredible shine and brightness to it as well. So yes, Mike, I'd just love to play the second video clip. This is the LA chamber orchestra. Shout out to everyone listening from LA. I think there are a lot of you. And this is the LA Chamber Orchestra playing a section of the work Dark with Excessive Bright. Okay, so that was a little clip of the double bass concerto Dark with Excessive Bright. And at this point, I'd love to move on to a discussion of opera and dramatic work and works with words and voices, but I'd love to actually answer some of your questions first.
Yes, well, I see one that I think is really interesting and also ties into the instrumental theme. So Alyssa is a clarinet teacher, and she has a 10-year-old student who, asked her to write down the music that she has been hearing in between lessons. And she asked you, do you have any advice on how I could healthfully support her continuation to write? And apparently she introduced Alyssa to the Luna Composition Lab for future consideration. So
I love that.
Yes.
Yes, that's so great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about my program Luna Lab, which is specifically geared towards encouraging very young female and non-binary students to compose. But I can say quickly that, I think that community is essential, and it's essential to see yourself represented in the composers that you see being celebrated. So I would say if you have any works by female composers you can have your student play, that will go a really, really long way. And as much as you can sort of show her examples of women and non-binary people who are writing, in Luna Lab, we give, many free masterclasses all year round that are free and open to the public and on Zoom. So anyone in the entire country can access these masterclasses, and most of them are with female and non-binary composers and performers. And all of them feature our current students, writing for these masterclass presenters. So if we had the cellist Jeffrey Ziegler give a masterclass, and all of our students wrote little excerpts for Jeffrey to play. So those people are represented on those masterclasses. So I just think that the worst thing is when you feel like you're the only person who is a female composer, or the only person who is a composer at all. So I think that being around other people who are interested in the same thing is really the key. But I will definitely talk more about that and how I support the younger generation who's starting to think about composition later. We also have, I will say, we also have a class called Adventures in Sound at Luna Composition Lab, which is for very beginning composers. So maybe it's a student who is very good on their instrument, or is taking lessons on an instrument, but they don't know how to start writing, but they've expressed some interest. And this class is really for those beginners. So there are more and more programs, and Luna Lab is definitely one of them.
And who were you listening to at age 10? Any women composers?
No, I wasn't. but I did, my mom, God bless her, is not a musician, but she got me a CD that was like music by women. It was like Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann. And I will tell you that that really had an impact on me. And I don't even think I was able to articulate it at the time, but just even seeing that this was something that women have been doing for centuries, even if they weren't celebrated to the level that men are and have been, it was really life-changing. So again, and when I first started meeting female composers, one of my first female mentors was Meredith Monk, who was a composer who I met when I was in my 20s in New York, and meeting her was life-changing. It only took one person to really change my perspective on what was possible. So, so I think a little can go a long way in terms of representation.
Wow, that Meredith Monk, that is quite impressive that she was your mentor in your 20s. That's fantastic. Well, I'll let you get on with the opera section. Thank you.
Sure. Yes. So also, I'm going to put up this. I forgot that I had control over the slides. So I'm going to put up this very moody slide that I made with a photo shoot I did in the Arctic, which it's a good story. Yes. So as I mentioned early on, a lot of my work in the last 10 years has been operatic in scope. I felt about 15 years ago in my late 20s that I really wanted a bigger platform. And I had this desire to surround the audience in an experience that they could really live in, as opposed to presenting, a 10-minute work on a program of other works that I did not choose. I wanted the option to immerse the audience in an experience that would last for an evening. And so as a composer, what does that mean? The most obvious answer is opera. Operas last an evening, and it's a work that you become completely immersed in. So I also around that time in my late 20s, I started to notice patterns in my work, and I noticed that I was very inspired by human beings and human drama. So even in, for example, the double bass concerto you just heard, I'm thinking of the melodies and the instruments in these very human terms, and as sort of characters that are working with each other or against each other, and characters that have their own motivation and their own backstory. So when I think of it that way, it's like this move into opera, and also some musicals, ballet, all of this I kind of put in one category as dramatic writing and storytelling through music. And when I look back, the move to that was sort of obvious, but it wasn't until I started writing opera that I realized, oh, this is really something that I love to write. I love the collaboration aspect with other artists, and just love the ability to tell stories about what is going on in our world now. Which is easier to do with words than without. So I'm just going to show a short documentary from 2017. This is from this company called, the series called Impromptu. And it's just, you'll hear me playing a little bit from the operas and talking a little bit about that role. Okay. So I think, yeah, so I would think what I'd love to do. Okay, great. Let me move to this next slide. Here we go. So I'd love to just talk specifically about a few of my operas. It's kind of starting from the beginning. I'm just going to play you some little trailers of these too. So I think opera is something that needs to be experienced visually as well as sonically. So I'll try to give you that as much of that full experience as I can. So my first opera premiered in 2012, and you're seeing a little scene from it here. This is Song from the Uproar: The Lives and Deaths of Isabel Eberhard. And as I mentioned, when I was in my late 20s, I really started to think about writing an opera and what that would mean. And around that same time, I discovered the journals and writings of Isabel Eberhard. Isabel Eberhard was a woman who actually lived. She was born in 1877 in Geneva, in Switzerland. And at a very young age, 19 or 20, she moved to North Africa by herself and led this very operatic, crazy life. She joined a Sufi sect. She dressed as a man. And you can kind of see in this slide this sort of version of this sort of a combination of masculine and feminine dress from that time in North Africa. And she joined a Sufi sect and converted to Islam, even though this was a sect that typically excluded women, but they accepted her as a man. She fell madly in love with an Algerian soldier, and they had this on-again, off-again relationship. And when she was 27, she died. She drowned in a flash flood that really wiped out a large part of this town in Algeria where she was living. And this whole time, when she was traveling, both in Europe and in Africa, and living as a man, essentially, she kept detailed journals. She wrote articles. She wrote a couple unfinished novels. And this writing was literally, a lot of it was washed away by the flood, and her husband had to come and pull her writing out of the water and dry it off. So, fast forward 100 years, she died in 1904. Fast forward to around 2004 when I discovered a new publication of her journals. And I just thought, I have to write something about this woman. This is such an extraordinary story, an extraordinary life. So I'd love to play a little bit of this. I'm going to play you a trailer, so you're going to see various clips, musical clips and video clips from the original production. Okay, so after that production happened, I was totally hooked on being in the theater, on collaborating with other people. As you can see, even though this was a small production by operatic standards, there was still a costume designer and a projection designer and a filmmaker and a set designer. And I was like, I love these people. These are my people. It was so fun to be collaborating in a room making art with other people, when so much of the business of composing is solitary. So much of it is just me in my studio alone trying to work out these things. And opera just brought, all of a sudden I was in the room with a bunch of other artists making something together, which was fantastic. So that was my first opera. I'm currently working on my fifth and sixth opera at the same time. So opera has been a huge part of my life ever since this production. So I'd like to move on. My second opera was actually an adaptation of the 1996 Lars von Trier film Breaking the Waves, which I'm not going to talk about tonight just because I don't have great video clips from it, and I want to be able to show you some of these trailers. So I'm going to skip over that one to talk about my third opera, Proving Up. Proving Up premiered in 2018, and this is an opera that is done I'm very happy about this because it's an opera that's done in universities and conservatories all over the country. And it's something that I think works with student singers as well as with seasoned professionals. So there was actually just a production last weekend at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. This is a piece that I've built to be able to be done by schools as well as professionals. So I'm glad that plan is working. Proving Up is based on a short story by the American writer Karen Russell, who is best known for, I think, for her novel Swamplandia, and she's also very well known for her short stories. So Proving Up is a short story that she published in, I think, 2011 in her book Vampires in the Lemon Grove, which I really recommend. It's a fantastic, surreal book of short stories. And so I'll just give a really quick synopsis. So Proving Up, I wanted to create this opera. My first sort of inklings of an idea for this opera was the idea to write an opera about the American dream. So who knows what that means, but I had this idea in my head, ever since the financial crisis in 2008. I was like, I really want to write an opera about the idea of the American dream, whether it's the origins of the American dream or the realities of the American dream or the myths around the American dream and where all those things intersect. I just was really, had been thinking about this for a long time. And so when I read Karen's short story, Proving Up, I thought, oh, this is a story about the American dream. And so I decided to turn it into an opera. This is a story and an opera that takes place in the late 1860s in the wake of the Homestead Act of 1862, which said that that Americans from the East could go out west and quote unquote settle the West. So never mind that there were already people living there, but this was part of the manifest destiny idea of building America and settling the West by allowing people to claim land. So obviously this is intensely problematic, and this idea that there were already lots of people living on this land when the white settlers went to claim it is addressed in the opera, but it's an opera about a lot of different things. And so for these settlers to create to sort of make a claim to their land, they had to fulfill certain requirements. So they had to have a certain amount of crops. They had to be on the land for 5 years. They had to have a house made of sod. And they also had to have a window in this house made of dirt, which to me is like the ultimate bureaucracy, the ultimate red tape. And for the U.S. government, it was a symbol of permanence that you would have this window. And what would happen would be that these neighboring homesteads would share a window. So the land inspector would come by and they would have the window at one homestead and they say, look, here's our window. We fulfilled all the requirements. And then they would surreptitiously run the window to another homestead and they would say, look, here's our window. We have all the requirements. This actually happened. So Karen made a story about a family who has fulfilled all the requirements. You can see them in this picture, in this slide here. They even have a window. And they're waiting for the inspector, and I won't give too much away, but things kind of go horribly wrong after they send their youngest son, pictured in the middle here, they send him out to deliver the window to a neighboring homestead. So I'm going to play for you a trailer that we actually made around the release of the recording. This is something that's recorded, it's on Spotify, and this was something that we filmed at Opera Omaha. And you'll see that this is a very unconventional opera production. The whole thing takes place on a runway of dirt, and with the audience kind of on either side, which was very exciting to me because so often we're so far away from the stage when we watch opera or when we watch a play. I really wanted to find a way to bring the audience closer and to create a sense of intimacy for them. So, so Mike, if you don't mind playing the next video clip for Proving Up. Okay, so it was a little taste of Proving Up. The next and final little opera clip I'm going to show you is from my most recent completed opera, which has the distinction of going viral on TikTok, which my collaborator, librettist, was really, really excited about. He's on TikTok, I'm not. But this is an opera called The Listeners. And this premiered at the Norwegian National Opera in Oslo in 2022, and it's actually coming to Philadelphia and Chicago this coming season. So it'll come to Philadelphia this fall. It will come to Chicago in about a year, in March of next year. So if you're in any of those cities, please come and say hi. So The Listeners, as you can see, is a really big piece involving a lot of people. And this is a story based on a story that I created in collaboration with my librettist, Royce Favrick, and also the Canadian writer, Jordan Tannehill, whose writing I've admired for a really, really long time. And we asked Jordan, the question, what would you do if we challenged you to create a story that had to sing first? So we'd done all these adaptations of stories and movies, and we set Jordan the challenge of creating a story for us that in its first outing into the world would be an opera. So he came up with the story of The Listeners. Just a really quick synopsis. This takes place in the American Southwest. This is a fictional story, but based on sort of elements of truth. And it takes place in the American Southwest. I always picture a suburb of Las Vegas, which I love the sort of strange landscape of where the wilderness meets the suburbia. And it centers on Claire Devon, who we see in the lower right-hand corner here in this photo. And she is she's a suburban soccer mom. She's a school teacher. And leading a very ordinary life, except that she is plagued by a hum that she keeps hearing in her mind. She's, it's plaguing her day and night. She can't sleep. She loses her job. And she, is really seeking relief from this constant noise. And this is based on certain phenomenon from around the world. There are these various hums in certain places in the world that sort of torment some of the people in the towns where they're happening. So Claire, out of desperation, finds a self-help group for people in the town who hear the hum, who hear the noise. And at the end of Act 1, we meet the group's leader, this very charismatic older man who you also see in the lower right-hand corner here, named Howard Bard. And in Act 2, the group takes on increasingly cult-like dimensions, and Howard is leading them through stranger and stranger rituals. And, spoiler alert, but at the end, it's revealed that Howard is a total fraud. He doesn't even hear the noise. And at the very final moment of the opera, Claire takes over the cult and kicks out Howard. So this is based on stories from actual cults. I went down an internet rabbit hole watching all these cult documentaries that have come out in the last couple of years about the Rajneeshis, Wild Wild Country, Nixium. Like there's a sort of a lot of cult documentaries out there right now. And so I took that as my inspiration for creating this opera. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to turn an opera chorus into a cult? So this image that you see here is the Norwegian National Opera Chorus pretending to be a cult, the cult of the hum. So I'm just going to play you a little 2-minute clip. This is a sort of promo clip that we made for the production in Oslo.
The reason I make operas is because opera is a place for big ideas, and opera has the scale and the forces to contain some really big, important questions. In the case of The Listeners, this is a piece about the role of charismatic leaders in our society, the need to belong in a modern day world. And this is one woman's journey through that struggle. And so I really want people to come out of it with having tapped into their own feelings about that in a little bit of a deeper way, or an unexpected way. She is in her nightgown. It is, 3 a.m, and she has stumbled out of her house onto the street, and she is talking to a coyote. This sense of unease. also just the sense of calm and being totally alone in the middle of the night.
With collaboration, you have to make space for people to inform the project and allow it to be better than the sum of its parts, way bigger than the sum of its parts. Now we're writing a piece about an American cult that takes place in the here and now, and her music finds a way of really digging into the psychology of these characters. I think she's just a magician in so many ways. Each project has its own logic, and there are some things that are going to be inherently more abstract, musically and textually, and then there are going to be things that are more narratively clear. And so I think that you have to allow the story to dictate how it is being told.
I think opera's superpower is in its ability to illuminate the subtext, so in its ability to illuminate what's going on inside these characters' minds. We're looking for solutions, looking for an easy solution, and life is very complicated and complex and mysterious.
I hope that when people go and see this work, I hope that they're completely intoxicated by Missy's music. They sort of come away feeling like there is a poetry to this world and a poetry to the everyday.
There's no clear answer to any of these questions, but that's sort of the point. You know, it takes the 2 hours of this opera to get into that sound world and even start to answer these questions.
So that man who was talking at the end is my closest collaborator, my librettist, Royce Favrick. So we're often hired together. He writes the words, I write the music. Yes, so before, I'm actually going to skip the next video, Mike, but I'm just going to move right into the third section of my talk, which is the advocacy part of this puzzle. But before I do that, I'm wondering if I should answer a quick question.
Well, one of the questions that came from Bridget was asking more about the music and the text and, maybe what comes first or how do you collaborate with a librettist?
Sure, good question. Yeah, so in the way that Royce and I collaborate is that the words always come first. So Royce will write a complete libretto. So it's like having a complete script before you start directing a film. So he'll write all the words and then I'll look at that and we'll shape the drama of it together a lot before I even start writing any music. Yeah, and I think that's usually the case in opera. I think in musical theater, sometimes it's a little bit different. Sometimes a melody or a song, the music for a song will come first, but in opera, it's usually the words.
And maybe what is the difference between an opera and a musical?
Yes, also a good question. Also one that I have increasingly more trouble answering. The traditional answer is always that an opera is sung through. So, there's constant music and singing, even in the dialogue parts. But in a musical, it's like there's a song and then there are people speaking and then there's another song. So there's numbers interspersed with more of a traditional play. But there are a lot of operas that have a lot of speaking in them too, even back to Mozart's Magic Flute, which was written in 1791, was really in the structure of a musical. So Mozart had a great tune, and then the characters would just speak the lines of dialogue, and then there'd be another great tune, and he called it a songspiel, like a song play. And then there are lots of musicals. You could argue that Hamilton is sung through and that there's never a gap. The music rarely, if ever, stops. So, there's some traditional definitions that differentiate them, but they're always composers that are blending the styles and bringing them closer together.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Great. So I'd just like to end the talk today by talking about the advocacy that I'm doing, particularly through my nonprofit Luna Composition Lab. For me, advocating for underrepresented voices in music is something that's increasingly inseparable from my music itself. I've devoted a large part of my life, especially recently, to advocating for increased representation of women and non-binary people in music composition. And that's something that I feel like I have to do. And it would not be satisfying. I would not be happy just writing music all the time. I feel like I need to combine that with a sort of teaching and advocacy in order to be a happy person. So I grew up as a musician, always being the only woman in the room, and that's usually not a healthy place to be. I found it very isolating, and as I mentioned before, in response to the listener's question, I found it very hard to see a future for myself as a musician when virtually none of the people that I was listening to or had studied with were women. I was in music school for 10 years after high school, and I did not have a single female teacher, not one. And this was not that long ago. I finished grad school in 2006, so it's not that long ago. And rarely did I see women who were celebrated by orchestras, opera companies, women who were writing film scores, music for dance, music for TV. And furthermore, what sort of really pushed me into advocacy was that, as I was starting my career in my 20s and early 30s, I was doing a lot of guest teaching around the world. So I would go around the US, around the world, lecturing to college students. And only one time in the hundreds of classes that I've spoken to did I ever see gender parity. Did I ever see a class that had equal numbers of men and women? And that was at the Curtis Institute of Music, where Jennifer Higdon, who's a female composer, that's where she taught for many, many years. So living with all of this, this really told me the fact that I wasn't seeing young women studying composition or young non-binary people who were interested in this as a profession. This told me that something was happening to them when they were in their teens that was discouraging them from entering the field. So 8 years ago, I was talking to my good friend, the composer Ellen Reid, about this, and we decided to create an institution that would address what we saw as the two main problems in, representing women in music. One was to create more role models for these young people, and also to give special attention to female and non-binary composers in their teens. So Luna Composition Lab, you're seeing our homepage of our website, was the solution for us. So Luna, as it mentions, Luna Composition Lab provides mentorship and performance opportunities to young composers who are female, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. We have a competitive application process, and we connect young composers. You can see this year's class of students. We connect each of them with prominent female mentors in the field, and they get one-on-one instruction twice a month from September to May, and then our season culminates in a big festival of their music. And we usually do this in New York. This year we're collaborating with the Kronos Quartet in San Francisco, so we'll be there for a week in June with all of these young people, and the Kronos Quartet will perform their music. We have a lot of master classes. So I just, as I mentioned also before, we have a sort of beginning composition class called Adventures in Sound for composers who are really just starting out their journey. And we also have an alumni support network where once a composer goes through our program, they have the option to apply for lots of grants and opportunities to get them started on their career. Starting a career in music can be very, very expensive. Apart from just paying for lessons, there are the application fees to apply for college. There's buying equipment, buying a keyboard, buying software, traveling to festivals. And we wanted to make it easier for these young people to launch into a career after they had finished the program. So what are my other slides here? So yeah, so you can see, this program has been going on for 8 years. We have dozens and dozens of alumni who are all out there doing incredible things. Last year, we had 19 of our alumni go to college. Every single one of them is studying music. Every single one of them is studying music composition. And every single one of them used the materials that they acquired in our program to get into college. So they leave our program with recordings, professional recordings. We offer letters of recommendation, and they have just a general support network of all these amazing people who share a little bit of their life experience, and they're always supporting each other, which is really lovely. So I'd like to just end by playing a little video, a little few-minute video. So Mike, this is the final video, which is just an overview of the program.
I'm a composer. 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 I am a composer. I am a composer. I'm a composer. I am a composer.
I'm a composer.
Luna Composition Lab is a program that we started in 2016, and it is a program that supports very young composers who are female, non-binary, or gender non-conforming.
Luna Composition Lab's mission is to close the gender gap in the field of music composition. Our signature fellowship program offers young composers one-on-one mentorship with acclaimed professional composers. Mentors guide fellows in the composition of a new piece of music that is premiered and recorded by a professional ensemble as part of a week-long festival of professional development, networking, and more. Luna Composition Lab also offers a series of group composition courses, Adventures in Sound, that support young musicians who are interested in creating their own music but are just starting their compositional journey.
These are the premier, most renowned female and gender non-conforming composers in the music scene. And it's absolutely incredible that I get to know these people on a first-name basis, that I can just email them with any questions. They give the absolute best career advice because they were in our position not so long ago.
This program has given me so many tools that I needed to be able to write the music that I've wanted to write but didn't feel like I necessarily had the know-how or ability to do.
And I'm so happy that we're able to work with these young folk and really kind of get them into the space where they can be the ones innovating the new music of the future.
Alumni of the fellowship program have gone on to receive national awards and attend the nation's top colleges and conservatories, and have been commissioned by renowned chamber ensembles and orchestras.
Seeing a young female artist making her own beautiful music changed my perspective, and I've been composing ever since.
So to have this kind of atmosphere where you're around people who are similar to you, who are marginalized and who have risen their voices in situations like this, it's really inspiring, and it just shows you that you can find like a source of solace in this field and that you're not alone.
So that is the end of my talk. Thank you all so much for joining me. I believe in the last 10 minutes I can take a few more questions. Oh, I also should mention, again, I know we have a lot of people from LA. My next opera will premiere at LA Opera in February of 2026, which I know sounds far away. It does not sound far away to me. I'm really freaking out about it. But so I will be in LA for a very long time. This is an opera called Lincoln in the Bardo, which is an adaptation of the George Saunders novel of the same name. So I would really love to connect with educators in Los Angeles who want to bring their students to see this. There's a lot of tie-ins to American history, literature, a lot of other things. So please come see Lincoln in the Bardo at LA Opera in February 2026.
Well, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And all right, we have a couple questions. So can you tell us about, a lot of the teachers that we have here, I'm guessing, may not be music teachers, but might be teaching history or English or something like that in the humanities. How would you incorporate music into a humanities classroom?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think that this is where opera is really effective. And I know that opera seems daunting if you haven't heard a lot of it, but like I described with all the stories behind my operas, it all comes from something else. It's all like Proving Up is about American history. This opera that I'm writing right now, Lincoln in the Bardo, is about American history. It's about it has the backdrop of the Civil War and a divided nation, and Lincoln, who, in 1962 is trying to figure out how to unite the country and end the war. And And I think my experience of being a kid and is that, even when a teacher would show the worst sort of documentary or reenactment, it was like burned into my memory. Or when there were like songs about things, it would burn things into my memory, and it was a way for me to absorb information. So I think digging into these the stories of operas and what inspired composers can be really interesting in a really interesting way in. It's a really big question. That's my best shot.
It is a huge question. Maybe you can answer this question. I think a lot of people have answers to what is an intro to an orchestral piece, maybe, maybe, I don't know, an example of an intro to orchestral music, but what would be maybe an intro to an opera for a younger audience? Maybe middle school, high school.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So there are, I think that it's really important to bring living composers into the equation. It's a very different thing to see opera as something that people did 400 years ago and or as an art form that people are working on now. So I'm thinking of, Janine Tesori, who is my colleague. We were both commissioned by the Met Opera at the same time. We were both the first two women to be commissioned by the Met. And she, has made her name writing musicals like Kimberly Akimbo and Carolina Change. But she also writes opera. And so her opera Blue is a really accessible opera about a family where the father is a policeman and the dynamics there. So there are a lot of operas out there. And I also think that some Baroque opera is very very fun and funny and interesting. And you don't have to play the whole thing for your students. I mean, that might sitting through a Handel opera that is 3 hours long is a lot for fourth graders. But playing excerpts, these are composers dealing with themes of love and heartbreak and betrayal. Just like every middle schooler is. And I think that seeing opera through that lens, there are a lot of different ways in, but I think the key is to see composers as people who are just trying to figure it out. We're all just experiencing this and trying to make sense of the world. And some of us do it through music. Some of us do it through trying to create a theatrical production to sort out our own feelings. And so I think that would be the way to approach it. Again, it's such a big question. I could have done a whole webinar on just that, but I hope that that's helpful.
It's funny that you mentioned Handel. That was probably my intro into opera. So yes, I would definitely recommend that. It's right, like you said, it can be very silly at times, which is kind of fun. Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. I'm looking at the questions. How did you overcome, the world of composition as an old boys club? How did you overcome that? You kind of answered that as that you found women mentors, but maybe you have other answers.
Yeah. I struggled a lot, it has taken me, over 20 years in this business to get to the point where I'm able to articulate all the things I just articulated to all of you, particularly about gender. And it took me 20 years to really start up something like Luna Lab and have the confidence and feel like I had a solution there, or a way, I had an idea of how to help, fix the gender imbalance in this field. But, I think that the key is community. The key is having friends who are also female, are also non-binary, are also gender non-conforming, share that aspect of your life experience, who are also writing music. And that is a big part of Luna Composition Lab. You saw a little bit of it in the video. It's this community that these young people are creating, and they have a million text chats and WhatsApp chats that they, between themselves, where every time one of them has a premiere, the whole community is yes, you got this. And that is something that we didn't create, that's something that arose spontaneously just by bringing all of these composers together. So I think that sense of community. Again, it doesn't have to be 25 other young people. It can be just like one other person who's also writing music, can be very helpful. Yes, and having mentors who look like you, I think is a really, really essential thing. And then I think that's a really big part of it. And I think that, orchestras and opera companies need to be held accountable. I mean, it was as recent as like 2018 when the Chicago Symphony and the Philadelphia Orchestra had whole seasons where it didn't feature a single female composer. It was just 100% male in 2018. This is not ancient history. So we can't underestimate the degree to which young women don't see themselves represented in this field. And so again, even a little bit of representation will go a long way. I mean, I hope eventually in 20 years, Luna Lab is no longer necessary. And because we will be, things will naturally, it'll be 50% female and non-binary individuals who are programmed. But until we're there, we have to be intentional about it.
Well, and probably too intentional about not just about composing and sharing living composers, and not just that's also been a big shift recently. So that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for such a great evening, and for everyone is really excited about learning more about opera and ways that they can bring it to their students, and they're so excited to visit you in 2026 and hopefully bring their students. So I hope you're able to connect with the LAUSD area and have some student performances during the day maybe.
Yes,
Right.
And really anywhere, as I mentioned, Philadelphia and Chicago. I'll be in Detroit next month. So I'm traveling all around the country with this music. And I'm always happy to talk to students. So don't hesitate to reach out.
And I'm assuming they can find everything that they would need on your website, right?
Yes. Yep. MissyMazzoli.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It has been a great evening. So I'll just share a couple other things about the National Humanities Center, just to make sure that we are all set for the next webinar. So our next webinar is on April 9th. What is the fact? Finding the truth in all the noise. And we'll have Seema Yasmin, the clinical assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at Stanford University. In her presentation, fake news is one of the most pressing and intractable problems of our times, but discussions about misinformation and disinformation often dwell in the problem space and perpetuate feelings of hopelessness and pessimism. In this evidence-based webinar, Dr. Yasmin highlights the tools we can use to teach and equip young people with the skills needed to separate fact from fiction. So I hope you're able to join us on April 9th. Thank you all so much.